It's strange how silence can sound like a scream when you're deep in the Appalachian woods. It's the kind of silence that makes you aware of your heartbeat, of the air in your lungs, of the way every step on the trail feels like it's echoing into something that's watching you back. My name's Evan Myers. I was 34 years old when I took that trip in the fall of 2018, a solo hike meant to clear my mind, to shake off the noise of life and find a little peace in the wilderness. But that peace never came. Instead, I found something else. Or maybe it found me. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains were my backyard, the Blue Ridge Parkway, the mist that rolled down like slow-moving ghosts, the sound of cicadas that rose and fell like waves. My father used to take me camping near the Pisgah National Forest when I was a kid. He'd say, "The woods will give you what you bring into them, Evan. Go in with peace, and they'll keep you safe." I used to believe that. But after what happened that October, I learned that sometimes the woods don't care what you bring. Sometimes they just take. I parked my truck near an old service road that branched off from the Appalachian Trail, one of those forgotten cuts through the mountains that locals talk about in half whispers. The kind of place where GPS gets confused and cell service dies completely. I'd planned 3 days of solitude, one night near a creek, another deeper up by an old fire tower, and then a slow loop back to the truck. It was supposed to be easy. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, a headlamp, just enough food to last. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I didn't think I needed to. That first night, the woods felt alive in a way that was comforting. The rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind brushing through the trees, all of it wrapped around me like an old song I'd forgotten the lyrics to. I built a small fire near the creek, boiled water, and watched the embers fade to ash. It was quiet, but not empty. There was life all around me. It felt good. I remember thinking, this is what people forget when they rush through life. The way stillness can make you feel real again. The second morning, I started my climb toward the tower. The trail was narrow, carved into steep slopes where the fog never seemed to lift. Around midday, I stopped to rest at a clearing. From there, the mountains rolled endlessly in all directions, blue, gray, and gold in the autumn sun. I ate a granola bar, drank some water, and that's when I noticed it. The forest had gone completely silent. At first, I thought it was me. Maybe I'd gone deaf for a moment. I looked around, waiting for a bird call, a breeze, anything. Nothing. Not even the buzz of an insect. It was like the whole mountain was holding its breath. That silence was heavy. You could feel it pressing on your skin. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself it was just a shift in the wind, but deep down something twisted in me. The instinct we all have, the one older than logic. It whispered, "Leave." I packed up and started moving again, faster than before. Every crack of a twig behind me made my pulse jump, but when I turned, there was nothing. No movement, no tracks, just that endless, unnatural quiet. By the time I reached the tower, the sun was low. The place was older than I expected. Half-rotted steps, rusted rails, the smell of old wood soaked in decades of rain. But from the top, the view was breathtaking, endless ridges fading into dusk. For a moment, I felt calm again until I looked down. There was someone standing at the edge of the clearing below, too far to make out clearly, but I could tell it was a man. He wasn't moving, just staring up at the tower. I shouted down, "Hey, you all right down there?" No answer. He didn't wave, didn't move. I shouted again, nothing. Then, in the blink of an eye, he turned and walked into the trees. No sound of footsteps, just gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the tower felt like a footstep on the stairs. I kept my knife close, flashlight in hand, watching shadows shift across the walls. Around 2 a.m., the wind died again, and the silence returned, that same suffocating, endless silence. Then came the knock. 3 sharp taps on the side of the tower. Not loud, but deliberate. I froze. My light trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the stairs. Nothing there. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. The knocking came again, this time lower, on the metal ladder that led up to the platform. Clang, clang, clang. Then nothing. Just that silence and my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I climbed down and found no footprints, no signs anyone had been there. The dirt around the tower was undisturbed, but the feeling that I wasn't alone clung to me like a second skin. I started packing to leave, fast. I didn't care about finishing the route. I just wanted out. Halfway down the mountain, I came across something that made me stop cold. A campsite. Not mine, older, maybe months old. The tent was torn open, a sleeping bag half buried under leaves, food still sealed in containers. It looked like whoever had been there left in a hurry, or was taken by surprise. I checked for any ID, any clue, but all I found was a small notebook, water-damaged and half-faded. Inside were fragments of sentences. The last one read, "The forest goes quiet before it comes." That was enough. I didn't stop again until I reached my truck. I drove for miles before I even looked back. But as I reached the main road, I realized something that's haunted me since. My watch. The one I'd checked every hour, the one I used to time my hikes, had stopped. The exact time, 2:03 a.m. When I got home, I searched for missing persons reports in the area. There was one that stood out. A hiker named Jacob Thorne, 32, vanished in 2017 near the same trail. The report said they never found a trace. I looked at his photo, and though I can't explain it, something in me knew that was the same man I saw below the tower. Since that trip, I've never gone back to those mountains. I still hike, but never alone, never without telling someone where I'm going. Because the woods aren't just trees and trails. They're alive in ways we don't understand, and maybe they remember. Sometimes at night, I dream of that silence again, the kind that swallows everything, even time. I dream of that man at the edge of the clearing, and the way he didn't move, didn't speak, like he was waiting for me to understand something. Maybe that there are places in this world where sound itself refuses to go, where life steps aside for something older, something we weren't meant to find. And if you ever find yourself deep in the Appalachian Mountains and the forest suddenly goes silent, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts. Pack up. Leave. Because the silence, it's not empty. It's a warning. I used to think the scariest thing about the wilderness was getting lost. But now I understand. It's not losing your way on a map that destroys you. It's losing your place in the world. The night I came down from that mountain, something inside me shifted. I wasn't the same man who'd hiked up there chasing silence and peace. The forest had shown me something, not evil, not good, just something vast, something beyond what we like to believe the world is. Weeks went by before I could even talk about it. When I'd close my eyes, I'd hear that knocking again, faint like it was still echoing from somewhere out there. I stopped going into the woods for a while. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that fear can make you see things that aren't there. But the truth, I wasn't afraid of what I saw. I was afraid of what it meant. Because deep down, I knew the forest had gone silent for a reason. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like something in that mountain was listening for me, testing how long I'd stay once the world went still. And it makes you wonder how many people heard that silence and didn't leave. Months later, I drove back to Asheville to see my father. He was older, frailer than I remembered. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. I told him what happened, every detail. The silence, the man, the tower, the notebook. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He just looked out toward the dark line of the ridges and said quietly, "There are places in these mountains where sound dies. The old-timers used to say it's because the land remembers what happened there, and it don't want it repeated." That stayed with me. The land remembers. Maybe that's what the silence was, memory. Maybe every tree, every stone carries the echoes of what's been lost there. Maybe that's why the woods sometimes grow still, not to threaten us, but to warn us, to say, "Stop, you're walking where you shouldn't." But most people don't listen. We think we own the trails, the campsites, the mountains. We forget they were here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. When you stand in that kind of place, a place older than memory, you either learn humility or you vanish trying to fight it. Since then, I've learned to listen differently. not just to the forest, but to the quiet parts of life, to the gut feeling that tells you something isn't right. I used to push past it, brush it off. But instincts are the language of survival, ancient, wordless, powerful. When the forest went silent, it wasn't just nature that changed, it was my own awareness. That silence forced me to listen to everything I'd been ignoring, my exhaustion, my loneliness, my pride. Maybe that's what it takes sometimes. Being stripped of all noise until the only thing left is truth. I tell this story not to scare people off from the mountains, but to remind them. Fear isn't the enemy. Fear is the voice that keeps you alive when logic falls apart. It's the whisper that says go home when the trail ahead looks fine but feels wrong. It's the same instinct that guided our ancestors through the dark when they didn't have maps or flashlights, just a sense, a pulse, a knowing. Every year, people vanish in the Appalachians. Some are found, some never are. Locals say the mountains take what they're owed, but I don't think it's that simple. I think some people ignore the silence. They see it as coincidence. They don't listen when the forest tries to speak. They don't leave when it tells them to. As for me, I still hike. I still camp. But I go with a kind of reverence now, like stepping into a cathedral made of roots and mist. When the wind shifts and the birds go quiet, I stop. I listen. I thank the forest for letting me be there. And if that silence lingers too long, I leave. Not out of fear, out of respect, because I've come to believe that the wilderness doesn't hate us. It tests us. It watches how we treat it, how we treat ourselves. The people who disappear out there, maybe they didn't just get lost on the trail. Maybe they lost the thread that ties a person to life, to reason, to humility. And when that breaks, the forest claims what's left. So if you ever find yourself hiking alone and everything around you suddenly falls quiet, don't wait. Don't reason it away. Don't tell yourself you're imagining things. That silence is truth speaking louder than sound ever could. Listen to it. Obey it. Leave if it tells you to, because the forest remembers, and the ones who don't become part of its silence. And maybe that's what happened to the man I saw that night. Jacob Thorne. Maybe he wasn't haunting those woods. Maybe he was the woods. Maybe when I looked down from that tower, I wasn't seeing a ghost. I was seeing what happens when the forest keeps what it's owed. I never went back there. But sometimes when I'm camping somewhere new and the night feels too still, I think about that silence again, the way it made everything inside me stop. And I realized that the real horror wasn't out there in the trees. It was realizing how fragile we are, how thin the line is between being part of the world and being swallowed by it. So I share this story for anyone chasing peace in wild places. Go, explore, seek it. But remember, the mountains have their own kind of peace. And sometimes that peace means quiet so deep it feels like the world has stopped breathing. If you ever feel that, take it as a sign. The forest doesn't want you there anymore. Because long after we're gone, the Appalachians will still stand, ancient, watchful, and full of silence. And somewhere out there between the ridges and the fog, maybe Jacob's still walking. Maybe he's still waiting for the next person who doesn't listen. And if you go quiet enough, maybe you'll hear him. It's strange how silence can feel alive out there in the woods, the kind of silence that listens back, that studies you from between the trees. I used to think the forest was peaceful, that solitude meant safety. But I learned on that trail, silence isn't always your friend. Sometimes it's a warning. My name's Eli. I'm 34, born and raised near the edge of North Carolina's portion of the Appalachian Trail. I've been hiking since I could walk, raised by a father who believed the woods were a kind of church, a place where you could hear what the world refused to tell you. But this story, this one changed the way I see that trail forever. It happened last autumn, in a stretch between Clingman's Dome and Fontana Dam, a lonely part of the trail where mist rolls through the ridges like breath, and shadows move even when the wind is dead still. I'd gone alone. That wasn't unusual for me. I liked solo trips, the clarity, the silence, the way the forest demanded respect. My plan was simple: 4 days, moderate pace, light gear. Just me, my pack, my tent, and the familiar hum of the Appalachian air. I left before dawn, when the trees were still black against the deep blue sky and the world felt half asleep. There's something holy about those first steps. When your boots sink into wet soil, when your breath fogs the morning, when it feels like the mountains are letting you in. The first day was uneventful. The trail was damp but firm, the sky a steady gray. I passed 2 other hikers, an older couple heading north, and a quiet man sitting by a fallen log with a half-burnt map in his hands. He nodded when I passed but didn't say a word. His eyes looked tired, like he'd been out there too long. I didn't think much of it then. It was the second night when things began to turn. I'd set up camp beside a small stream, maybe a mile south of an unmarked clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and the air carried that earthy smell you only get when the rain has soaked through every root and leaf. I made a small fire, cooked some beans, and wrote a few lines in my journal. Ordinary stuff. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to the feeling that something was wrong. You know how your mind works when you wake up in a tent, half dream, half instinct. At first, I thought I just imagined it. Then I heard it again. A sound. Not close, but not far either. A steady crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, somewhere in the darkness beyond the glow of my fire. I froze. The forest was still. No wind, no crickets, nothing but those measured steps. Then silence. I waited, heart pounding, ears straining. After a while, I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a stray hiker setting up nearby. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. At sunrise, I stepped outside. The air was sharp with cold. I found tracks in the mud near the stream. Not boot prints, but bare feet. Small, but not a child's. The toes were splayed, the edges deep, like whoever it was had been carrying weight. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they disappeared into the undergrowth. That's when I noticed something else, a piece of twine hanging from a branch, tied into a crude knot. It looked recent. It's funny how quickly curiosity turns into dread. I wanted to believe it was nothing, maybe someone marking a path, but something about it felt intentional, personal. I packed up faster than usual and hit the trail. The forest that day felt different. The way light filtered through the canopy, the way sound carried. Every snap of a branch made me turn my head. Every shadow felt a little too alive. Around mid-afternoon, I started feeling it again, that sense of being watched. I stopped to drink from my flask and noticed the woods had gone quiet again. No birds, no rustle, just that heavy Appalachian stillness. I scanned the trees, my hand tightening around my trekking pole. That's when I saw it. A figure, maybe 50 yards back, standing between 2 pines, still as stone. I couldn't make out their face, but I could see enough. A shape, thin, unmoving, facing my direction. I called out. No answer. I took a step toward them. They shifted, slow and deliberate, and then gone. Just gone, like they'd melted into the trees. I didn't run. Not yet. The woods play tricks sometimes. Light bends, your eyes deceive you. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I pitched my tent deep off-trail behind a fallen log. I figured if someone was following me, I'd be harder to spot. I sat there for hours, listening. The night was alive, the kind of quiet that hums, that presses against your skin. Sometime past midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow, closer this time. I held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear it, the faintest sound of breathing. Not an animal, a person. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't move, didn't dare unzip the flap. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. The footsteps retreated into the woods. I lay awake until dawn, my knife clutched against my chest. When I finally stepped out, there were fresh prints in the mud, the same bare feet, but now there were 2 sets. That morning, I didn't eat. I didn't even check my map. I just walked. I walked faster than I ever had in my life. The forest closed in around me, the air heavy and damp. Every sound set my nerves on edge. Every crack, every rustle, every whisper of leaves. And then came the smell, faint like smoke mixed with something rotten. I turned around. No one there. But I could feel it. Something was following. By midday, I reached an old ranger cabin, one of those weathered wooden shacks used decades ago. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging. I almost passed it by, but instinct told me to stop. Maybe I just needed shelter, or maybe I wanted to face whatever this was. Inside, the air was thick with dust, empty cans, rusted tools, a torn sleeping bag. But on the wall, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were words that made my stomach turn cold. Open quote, "Don't look back." Close quote. The message was carved deep, desperate. Beneath it, another line, barely legible. Open quote, "It follows." Close quote. I remember standing there, hand trembling against the wall, wondering if someone had written it for me or if they'd written it too late. That's when I heard it again. The same crunch of footsteps, but this time they were running. I bolted out the back, heart hammering, my legs moving before my brain could catch up. I didn't look back, not once. Branches tore at my arms, the trail disappearing beneath my boots. I could hear it behind me, matching my pace. Not close enough to see, but close enough to feel. The forest felt endless, every tree identical, every turn a mirror of the last. I don't know how long I ran. Eventually the sound faded, my lungs burned, my legs shaking. When I finally stopped, I realized I'd reached a small clearing overlooking the valley. And in that moment, in the stillness, with the wind whispering through the pines, I understood something that shook me to my core. Whatever had followed me wasn't chasing me anymore. It was guiding me. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? The idea that something out there in the woods, something unseen, could guide instead of hunt. But standing in that clearing, staring into the mist rising from the valley below, that's exactly what I felt. I don't know how to explain it. The air wasn't thick with fear anymore. It was heavy, yes, but with meaning. Like the forest was trying to tell me something I hadn't been ready to hear until now. I dropped my pack and sat on a rock, trying to calm my breath. The trees around me creaked with the slow rhythm of the wind. Somewhere far off, a raven called. One, then another. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time since this began, I wasn't running. I was listening. And in that stillness, fragments of memory started to surface, flashes of things I'd ignored on this trail before. The stories my father used to tell me about the spirits of the mountains. He said the woods held every soul that had ever gotten lost out here, that they never really left, that they wandered the ridges and hollows, watching over those who dared to cross their paths. I'd laughed at that once, but now I wasn't so sure. I looked down at my boots, caked in mud, trembling hands resting on my knees. I realized I hadn't truly been paying attention. Not to the trail, not to my surroundings, not even to myself. I'd been hiking these woods for years, like I owned them, like experience made me immune to danger. But out there, experience doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you predictable. The forest learns your rhythm. That thought chilled me more than anything. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, bleeding gold through the tree line. I knew I couldn't stay in the open. So I gathered my pack, took one last look at the valley, and moved north. Slower this time, deliberate. The feeling of being watched hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer predatory. It was observant, curious, almost protective. For hours I walked in silence until twilight swallowed the last of the light. I found a narrow ridge overlooking a river and decided to camp there for the night. I didn't make a fire. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I sat in the dark, my back against a tree, staring at the endless silhouette of mountains rolling beneath the stars. And then I heard it again. The steps. But this time, they didn't come from the trees. They came from the trail itself, behind me, steady and sure. I turned my head, heart pounding, ready to see another shadow. Instead, I saw something else entirely, a light, a small flickering lantern swaying just beyond the bend of the trail. Someone, or something, was walking with it. The glow was faint, but it moved with purpose, weaving slowly toward me. I wanted to call out, to demand who they were, but my voice caught in my throat. The light paused, then began to move again, this time turning off the path and vanishing into the woods. And I knew. I was meant to follow. I can't explain why I trusted it, but I did. I picked up my pack and followed the glow as it drifted between the trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The air thickened and the sound of the river faded until all that remained was the pulse in my ears. The light bobbed ahead, always just out of reach. Then it stopped. In front of me was a fallen tree, massive, ancient, covered in moss. Beneath it, a small opening led into the hillside. The lantern's glow hovered there for a heartbeat, then dimmed, as if it were urging me closer. I knelt down and shone my headlamp into the gap. Inside, half buried in dirt, was a decayed backpack. The color had long since faded, but a torn patch on the strap was still visible. It read, faintly, L. Harper. The name hit me like a wave. Liam Harper. He'd gone missing on this section of the trail 3 years ago. A solo hiker, just like me. They'd found no trace of him. No body, no gear, nothing. His story was one of those whispered ones locals pass along in trailhead parking lots, the kind that gets a cautious shake of the head and a muttered, poor guy, never go alone. I stared at that pack for what felt like forever. My hands were shaking as I brushed the dirt away. Inside, I found a few rusted tools, a compass cracked down the middle, and a waterlogged journal. The pages were barely legible, but one entry stood out. A line scrawled across the center of the page, written in a frantic hand. Open quote, something followed me for miles, but it wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to lead me home, close quote. The breath left my lungs. I sat back on my heels, the forest pressing in around me. The lantern's light was gone. Total darkness now. But I didn't feel afraid anymore. Not in the way I had before. It was as if that presence, whatever it had been, had finally finished what it started. I buried the pack deeper into the soil, covered it with moss and leaves. I whispered a quiet thanks, not to the man who'd carried it, but to the force that had led me there. Then I turned and made my way back to the trail. The walk back felt different, lighter. The woods no longer seemed like they were closing in. They felt open, endless. I could hear the sounds again. Crickets, wind, the distant trickle of water, life. By the time I reached the trailhead the next afternoon, the sun was warm on my face. I turned to look back one last time. The forest stood silent, as if waiting. I raised my hand, and for the first time in days, I smiled. Something had followed me for miles on the Appalachian Trail, but not everything that follows you in the dark means harm. Sometimes it's a reminder, a warning, a guide. Out there, in those deep Appalachian woods, fear isn't the enemy. Ignorance is. The forest doesn't want your confidence. It wants your humility. It demands that you listen, that you respect the silence, that you understand every sound, every shadow, every chill in the air has a story behind it. And if you listen long enough, you'll realize something beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The woods don't care who you are. But if you walk them with reverence, if you move through them with your eyes open and your heart still, they might just let you leave with a story or a warning that could save your life. So when you hike, remember this. Trust your instincts, but more than that, trust the silence. Because sometimes the things that walk beside you in the dark aren't there to harm you. They're there to make sure you find your way out. And maybe, just maybe, to remind you that the forest never forgets who enters. It only decides who gets to leave. As I stepped into the fading sunlight at the trailhead, I felt the weight of those miles and of that unseen companion settle into my bones. The forest behind me didn't just hold trees and trails. It held secrets, lessons, and lives that drifted between shadow and mist. And in that realization, I understood something crucial. Stories like this aren't just meant to scare you. They're meant to awaken something deeper. Respect, awareness, the courage to face uncertainty, and the humility to honor forces bigger than ourselves. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's that the woods are always watching. Not with malice, but with patience. They see every choice we make, every path we take. And sometimes, when you think you're alone, you're not. Something may be walking beside you. Something older, wiser, something that knows more about survival, fear, and courage than any of us ever will. So the next time you lace up your boots and step into the silence of the Appalachians, I want you to pause. Listen. Pay attention to the subtle hints, the cracks of branches, the distant echoes, the way the wind moves through the leaves. Don't rush. Don't ignore. And don't underestimate the lessons hidden in shadows, because the forest doesn't hand out warnings twice. I shared this story not just to chill your spine, but to remind you that adventure and danger are two sides of the same coin. Every trail has its ghosts, every night its unknowns, but the courage to face them, to move forward despite fear, is what separates the stories that scare us from the ones that change us. If this tale stirred something inside you, whether it was fear, curiosity, or that restless itch to step into the wild, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like you weren't alone on a hike, or if the woods have ever whispered warnings you couldn't ignore. Share your experiences, your chills, your lessons. And if you want to keep walking these trails with me, through the shadows, the mist, and the stories that don't end in daylight, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because every week we're uncovering the deep, dark heart of the Appalachian forests, one story at a time. Remember, the forest is patient. It waits for those who respect it. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, it just might lead you to a truth you weren't expecting. Stay alert, stay humble, and never forget, the things that follow you may not always be what they seem. The first time I stepped into the Appalachian backcountry alone, I thought I knew fear, but the forest laughed at my ignorance. My name is Eli Mercer. I'm 34, and I grew up chasing trails and creeks that twisted through the foothills, believing the woods were merely a playground for the curious. But on that late October morning, the trees were not silent companions. They were watchers. The map in my pocket felt thin, almost useless, against the living expanse around me. I parked my old Jeep at a trailhead just north of Nantahala National Forest, where locals warned that the woods speak if you listen too closely. I smiled at the quaint superstition and hoisted my pack, the weight, a comforting reminder that I had prepared. At first, it was ordinary, crunching leaves beneath boots, the smell of wet pine, and the distant scream of a hawk, but I soon learned that even ordinary woods can betray your sense of safety. The first oddity came when I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. My compass spun uselessly, and the sun, low but bright, seemed swallowed by the thick canopy. I could feel the change before I saw it. The air grew heavier, almost viscous, pressing on my lungs as if the forest itself were aware of my intrusion. I laughed to myself, trying to shake off the tension, and told my camera, strapped to my chest, "It's just nerves. Happens to everyone alone in the woods." But as I took a cautious step toward a faint trail marker, I heard it, a whisper. Not loud, not a scream, but a low, shivering sound that slithered around the base of the oaks. It was my name. Eli. I froze. My pulse rattled like loose chains, no wind, no one around for miles, and yet the forest spoke. I whispered back, half mocking, half afraid, "Who's there?" The echo of my own voice mocked me. Silence. And then a rustle. Somewhere just out of sight, something shifted, deliberate and human-like. My training as a hiker, the countless survival lessons, the careful packing of first aid and fire-starting tools, none of it mattered against this palpable, creeping dread. I remember taking slow breaths, counting each one, forcing myself to walk forward. The trail I had been following disappeared into a choked thicket of undergrowth and brambles. The air smelled damp, earthy, alive. Shadows moved in ways that didn't obey the sun, brushing across my peripheral vision, and every time I turned to look, there was nothing. But I wasn't imagining the sound of footsteps behind me, light and deliberate, mimicking my pace. I stopped, heart hammering, listening. The forest quieted, but that whisper, my name again, more urgent now, slid through the trees, almost sorrowful. It was then I realized I was not alone in any conventional sense. Something was following me, not out of hunger, not out of malice yet, but out of intent. Something patient, waiting to see what I would do. Hours passed, though time itself felt distorted, the forest swallowing the sun. I reached a stream, hoping the water would calm my nerves. I knelt, cupped my hands, and drank, but the ripples in the surface reflected more than the canopy, fleeting glimpses of a figure standing just beyond the trees. A man, perhaps a stranger, perhaps an echo of some other traveler lost long ago. Fear turned into calculation. I moved upstream, circling, hoping to flush whoever it was out or confirm my own sanity. Nothing. Only the whispering. My name again. Not quite human. Not quite wind. I remembered advice an old local had given me years ago. Never answer what calls you by name in the woods. It's not asking, it's testing. But my curiosity, stubborn, reckless, made me whisper back, "Who are you?" The response came not in words, but in action. Leaves snapped, twigs cracked under some weight heavier than mine, and the temperature dropped so sharply that my breath hung like smoke. I was staring at shadows that shifted independently, slithering around the trees. Every instinct screamed to run, but running would have been foolish. The forest was dense, and panic is the predator that walks beside you in the dark. I lit my small lantern, the yellow light cutting a circle in the dense gloom, and there, in that thin radius of illumination, I saw it, or saw enough to make my blood freeze. Eyes glinting too high, too wide, watching from branches and brush alike. I counted at least 3, maybe 4 pairs, unblinking, unafraid. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence, thick and suffocating. I realized then that the forest itself was the predator, using forms, shadows, and voices as instruments to study, to unsettle, to weigh my courage against my folly. I camped that night by the stream, not daring to set up fully, only enough to shield myself. Sleep was intermittent, punctuated by whispers, shifting shadows, and the knowledge that in these woods, being prepared meant less than being alert to the unseen. I replayed every survival lesson, every warning ever uttered by locals, and felt a creeping humility I hadn't known. By dawn, I had mapped a tentative route, choosing higher ground, a ridge path that would give me visibility. But even walking in daylight was treacherous. Every rustle, every bird call sounded like mimicry. I learned quickly that fear is not just a reaction. It is a teacher. It forces you to observe, to measure, to adapt. And in these woods, adaptation was the only language that mattered. By mid-morning, I encountered an abandoned cabin, half swallowed by the forest. Its door hung on a single hinge, and the air inside smelled of rot and pine needles. I stepped in, noting the remnants of old fires, a chair overturned, and symbols etched into the wood, a warning, perhaps, from someone who had experienced the same attention I now felt. I set my pack down, documenting it with my camera, but a shadow moved across the far wall, just a flicker, but unmistakable. I froze, heart racing, calculating my options. The door slammed. I was alone, and yet the presence that haunted me was asserting itself, a silent reminder that the woods were not passive, and neither was their curiosity. I whispered into the dim cabin, "I mean no harm." The forest, or whatever embodied it, paused. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the stillness receded. I left the cabin with the same caution I would give a snake, steps measured, senses stretched taut. By the time I reached the ridge, exhaustion wrapped around me like a wet blanket, and yet I felt a strange clarity. Every whisper, every shadow, every terrifying moment had sharpened me. I was no longer just a hiker, I was a participant in the living, breathing ecosystem of fear and survival. The sun was low, painting the valley in golden orange fire, and I understood that these woods had tested me not out of cruelty, but out of their own inscrutable logic. They demanded respect, attention, and humility. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, they acknowledged my endurance. I spoke aloud to the wind, to whatever eyes had followed me. "I hear you. I respect you." The whisper returned once more, faint, almost a sigh, and then vanished. I descended the ridge slowly, carrying the weight of both dread and understanding. When I finally returned to my Jeep, the forest behind me seemed stiller, almost deferential. I drove in silence, knowing that the woods that whispered my name had changed me. They had revealed the limits of human confidence, the necessity of listening to instincts over assumptions, and the strange, beautiful terror of being truly alone in a world older, wilder, and wiser than myself. Even now, I can feel those whispers in the quiet moments, a reminder that the woods are patient and the forest never forgets those who dare to enter unprepared. I learned that survival is not merely a checklist of tools and supplies. It is a dialogue with the unknown, a conversation where silence often carries the heaviest meaning. And sometimes the greatest lesson is simply to recognize that fear is not the enemy. It is the guide, the unseen hand leading you through the deep and shadowed trails of both the forest and your own soul. The sky darkened faster than I expected, as if the Appalachian peaks themselves were swallowing the last light. I had intended to reach a small campsite marked on my map, a patch of flat ground near a ridge I knew from old hiking journals. But every step forward seemed to fold the woods in on themselves, the familiar paths twisting into corridors of shadow. My flashlight's beam cut a thin swath through the darkness, and I felt the whispering again, not calling my name this time, but a low, almost conversational murmur that tickled my awareness, impossible to ignore. "You've come far, Eli. Far enough to see." The voice was neither threatening nor friendly, just intimate and knowing, like the forest had been watching, recording, waiting for me to understand something I hadn't yet realized. My skin prickled. I slowed my pace, letting my ears and eyes take the lead over my rational mind. In these woods, reason alone was a poor shield. The deeper I walked, the more surreal the forest became. Shapes emerged in the darkness, gnarled trees that resembled twisted figures, moss-draped limbs that seemed to point or beckon. I stumbled over roots here where none should have been, and the whispers pressed in around me. 1,000 tiny voices layered atop one another, indistinct, yet undeniably real. And then I saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, flickering through the trees like a candle struggling against the wind. My heart leapt with a mix of hope and dread. Was it another camper, lost like me, or had I wandered into some trap conjured by the forest itself? I approached cautiously, every muscle taut, knowing instinctively that whatever lay ahead would test my courage as nothing before had. As I drew closer, the light resolved into a small fire, perfectly contained as if it had been placed there deliberately. Around it sat a figure, hunched and wrapped in a tattered blanket, its face hidden in shadow. I called out softly, careful not to startle, "Hello? Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond, merely rocked slightly, almost in time with the wind. A chill ran down my spine, for the movement was too deliberate, too synchronized, as though the forest itself had animated it. I considered retreating, turning back to the ridge, but something inside me demanded understanding. I took a step closer, the whispers now forming a coherent rhythm in my mind, a cadence that matched my heartbeat. The forest wasn't merely testing me, it was communicating, challenging me to see beyond my fear, to witness without imposing my will. I crouched beside the fire, feeling the warmth brush my cold skin, and the figure finally stirred, lifting its head slowly. Its eyes were sharp and bright, piercing the darkness in a way that made my breath catch. "You've heard them," it said, voice gravelly but unmistakably human. "Few do, most hear and run, but running doesn't answer their questions." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Questions. The forest had questions, and somehow I had stumbled into its inquisition. The figure gestured toward the trees, toward the shadows that now seemed alive with intent. "Every step you take here is observed, every hesitation noted. The woods remember, and they speak to those willing to listen, not just hear." I felt the weight of those words sink into me. The fear that had driven me to hyper-awareness wasn't punishment. It was an invitation to understand, to meet the unknown with clarity rather than panic. Night deepened, and I realized I had been speaking aloud to the figure, recounting the strange events of the day, the whispers, the shadows, the nameless eyes, and with each word a strange peace began to settle over me. Fear was still present, sharp and cold, but it no longer controlled me. I was learning to move through it, not just survive it. The figure nodded occasionally, a silent acknowledgement, and when I finally rose to leave, it spoke one last warning. "Trust your instincts. Respect the forest, and it will guide you. Ignore them, and you become prey not of the forest, but of yourself." The words echoed in my mind long after the fire had gone out, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and pine. As I ascended the ridge toward dawn, the forest seemed to shift in tone. Shadows stretched, but no longer in menace. Whispers faded into the rustling of leaves, a gentle murmur rather than a call to fear. I could feel the lessons of the night embedding themselves deep within me. The necessity of vigilance, the humility required to move through spaces older and wilder than myself, and the strange, awe-inspiring beauty of a world that watches without malice, but with relentless attention. By the time I emerged from the tree line into the pale light of morning, my Jeep waiting at the trailhead, I was different. Not braver in a conventional sense, but more attuned to the subtle currents of life and fear, understanding that the truest dangers are often not external, but within ourselves, our assumptions, our arrogance, our denial of what we cannot see. Driving away, I felt a lingering awareness, a quiet acknowledgement from the forest that I had passed its test, or perhaps that I had been permitted to leave, granted a reprieve from the same scrutiny that had unseated so many who came before. The woods that whispered my name were no longer a source of terror alone. They had become a mirror. And I realized that every hiker, every wanderer who ventures into places so old and alive carries the responsibility to listen, to respect, and to learn. There are no shortcuts, no clever tricks, and no certainty in the deep Appalachian shadows. Only the raw, undeniable truth that fear and reverence are companions, walking side by side through the thick, whispering trees. Even now, years later, I return in memory, closing my eyes and hearing the faint echoes of those voices, the rustle of unseen limbs, the weight of the forest pressing down in a gentle, insistent way. The experience transformed me, not merely as a hiker, not merely as a storyteller, but as someone who understands the depth of the world beyond human measure. Those woods whispered my name, and in answering, I discovered not just fear, but understanding, resilience, and an unshakable sense of connection to something immense and eternal. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the forest, that it asks nothing but attentiveness, teaches with relentless honesty, and reminds those who venture within that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to listen, to respond, and to emerge forever changed. The final stretch of that journey remains vivid in my mind, even when decades of trails and seasons have passed. The ridge I followed that morning seemed to extend endlessly, a spine of granite and roots carved over millennia, guiding me as much as I guided myself. Every footstep echoed with the memory of the night before, the whispers, the eyes, the fire that had both terrified and taught me. I realized then that the forest's test was not merely survival or endurance, it was an excavation of the self. Fear had stripped away everything superfluous, leaving only raw perception. Each shadow, each whisper, each rustle of leaves was a question I had to answer, not with tools or skill, but with presence. And so I walked with my senses stretched taut, with reverence for the unseen, understanding that the woods demanded honesty, attentiveness, and a willingness to acknowledge limits I had never admitted existed. By mid-morning, the trail led me to a cliffside overlooking the valley below. Mist clung to the slopes like memory itself, swirling and shifting in shapes that teased the edge of recognition. I paused, heart still racing but tempered now by clarity. I thought about the figure of Uri the fire, its warning, its almost parental guidance in a place that offered no kindness without consent. I understood something then. The forest had no malice. Its terror was its language. The whispers were not meant to scare, but to teach. And I was finally listening. I sat on a boulder at the edge of the cliff, letting the wind cut across my face, tasting the sharp tang of pine and cold earth, and for the first time that night and morning, I allowed myself to simply breathe, to absorb the depth of what had passed. The forest had tested me, and in doing so had revealed the fragile, luminous line between fear and understanding. As I continued down the ridge, I noticed the subtle signs I had ignored on the way in, the broken branches pointing a careful path, the animal tracks that seemed almost ceremonial in their pattern, the faint glimmer of lichens that marked safe footing. It became clear that the woods had been guiding me all along, offering clues to the attentive hiker who could resist panic and listen instead. I thought about every mistake I had made, answering the whispers, moving too hastily, letting my mind fill gaps with imagined threats. And I thought about every choice I had made that had preserved me, pausing, observing, respecting what I could not see. The forest had become a mirror, reflecting both my weaknesses and my growing capacity to navigate them. The descent was gradual but relentless. Sunlight began to push through the trees, dappling the forest floor with gold and amber. Shadows that had once threatened now seemed protective, forming corridors and guardians that marked the path. The whispers faded into the rustle of leaves, not absent but softened as though satisfied by my attention and humility. I felt a deep, reverent connection, the kind that can only be forged in true isolation, in a place where the line between human and wilderness blurs. By the time I reached the creek near my Jeep, the forest had returned to its ordinary guise. Trees standing silently, streams moving lazily, birds singing without pretense. And yet I carried its lessons inside me like a pulse that would never stop, a whisper I could always hear in moments of doubt or fear. Sitting in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, I reflected on the full arc of that ordeal. The woods that whispered my name had not merely frightened me. They had rewritten my understanding of courage, patience, and attentiveness. I realized that every hiker, every camper who ventures into these Appalachian shadows is offered the same challenge, to recognize that fear is not the enemy, but a teacher. That the unknown is not simply a threat, but a dialogue, a test of presence, humility, and respect. And above all, that survival is not measured by the absence of danger, but by the willingness to see, to listen, and to respond with clarity rather than reaction. I drove away slowly, the morning sun glinting across the windshield, the forest receding into the rearview mirror. And yet, I knew that it would always be with me. The whispering, the eyes, the lessons carved into my consciousness like rings in an ancient tree. I had entered those woods as a hiker seeking adventure. I left as someone who had glimpsed the profound intelligence of the wild, someone who understood that fear, when faced with respect and awareness, can become the most illuminating teacher. The woods had called me by name, and in answering, I had discovered not only the limits of human confidence, but the vastness of what it means to truly listen, to truly see, and to truly live with the wilderness as both challenge and companion. Even now, whenever I step into a forest, I carry that memory like a second skin. I feel the subtle pressure of awareness, the gentle insistence of the unseen, the whispers that are never fully gone. And I tell every friend, every new hiker, every wanderer daring to enter the deep Appalachian trails, do not fear the woods, but do not underestimate them. Listen, watch, move deliberately, and remember that the forest, in its patient, ancient way, always remembers those who venture within. It remembers names, footsteps, mistakes, and courage alike. It speaks to those willing to hear. And for me, the woods that whispered my name will always be more than a place. They will always be a story, a teacher, and a mirror reflecting the edge of fear and the depth of understanding we rarely encounter in the ordinary world. I remember the night we got lost like it's burned into the walls of my memory. You don't forget something like that. The sound of your own breath echoing in the dark, the way the forest closes around you when it realizes you don't belong there anymore. My name's Eli Parker. I was 27 back then, a weekend camper who thought he knew the woods because he'd walked a few trails and read a few maps. That night in the Appalachians taught me otherwise. It was late October, just as the leaves had turned to rust and flame. The air had that sharp smell of rot and pine that only comes right before the first frost. My buddy Mason and I drove up to a clearing near the Blue Ridge, planning to hike a small loop trail that was supposed to reconnect with our base camp before sunset. But the forest had other plans. We'd been told by a local at the gas station that the trail could get confusing after dark. Follow the reflective markers, he'd said. They'll guide you back to the lot. Simple enough, we thought. We had flashlights, compass, GPS, everything a couple of weekend wanderers could need. But there's something strange about those hills. Once you step off the main trail, the forest begins to change its shape. What looks like a path 1 minute disappears into a web of deer tracks the next. The light fades quicker there too, as if the sun has to fight its way through the thick, gnarled canopy. By the time the sky started dimming to purple, we'd gone too far. We should have turned back hours before, but we were chasing something we couldn't name, a kind of quiet, a kind of proof. You never realize how loud civilization is until you find yourself deep enough that even your own footsteps sound intrusive. The deeper we went, the more those reflective markers caught our attention. Small, metallic dots on trees, glinting faintly in our headlamps. At first, they felt like a lifeline. They meant direction, order, safety. But later that night, those same markers became the reason we almost didn't make it out. The first sign that something was wrong came when Mason noticed the same crooked pine twice. It had a split trunk that looked like a serpent's tongue, something you couldn't mistake. "We've been here already," he said, his voice too calm for what he was realizing. I didn't want to believe it. I told him the woods just looked similar, that our minds were playing tricks under the dim light. But when we found a discarded granola wrapper near the base of that same tree, the one Mason had dropped earlier, it hit me. We weren't following a trail anymore. We were walking in circles. The markers were still there, though, bright as ever, almost too bright when the flashlight hit them. They beckoned us, one after another, deeper into a darkness that felt unnatural. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a pattern. Every 50, maybe 60 feet, another gleaming dot, always leading left, always slightly downhill. I remember how Mason started counting steps between them, muttering under his breath, trying to prove there was some kind of logic. But the deeper we followed, the more disoriented we became. Our compass needle twitched and stuttered, pointing nowhere steady. My GPS flickered out. Low battery, it claimed. We both knew it wasn't just the battery. It's hard to describe how silence feels when you're surrounded by thousands of trees. It's not empty, it's dense. You start hearing things that might not be there, the snap of a branch, a whisper that could be the wind, or something else entirely. At one point, I thought I heard a voice behind me, low and dragging, like someone trying to catch a breath. Mason froze too. We swung our lights around, but there was nothing. Just trees. And yet I swear I saw a glint, another reflector, but higher this time, too high to be on a tree trunk. Almost like something was holding it. We tried shouting. Our voices didn't travel far. They just bounced back, muted, like the forest didn't want them. The markers led us to a slope where the ground was damp and soft. Our boots sank slightly with each step, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Then, Mason's flashlight flickered out, total black. We scrambled to relight it, panic scraping at our throats. When it came back on, we saw something that made both of us go silent. The next marker was nailed not to a tree, but to a piece of wood sticking up from the ground, like part of a post. A grave marker, maybe. We stood there for a long time, too long. I remember how the woods seemed to listen to us, waiting. I told Mason we should turn around, but he shook his head. If we backtrack, we'll just keep looping. We have to break off. He pointed in a direction that had no markers, no path, just pure black forest. It felt like stepping into water you couldn't see the bottom of, but we did it anyway. We cut off the trail, walking toward the faint sound of running water. The ground sloped sharper, the air colder. Something in me knew this was the right move, though my body trembled the whole time. Eventually, we found a small stream, barely more than a trickle. Streams lead somewhere, I told myself. If we followed it, we'd reach a road or at least a clearing. That logic was all that kept us moving. We followed the water for nearly an hour before we saw light, not the harsh beam of our lamps, but a faint orange glow flickering through the trees. Firelight. Relief hit so hard it almost hurt, but when we got closer, we realized it wasn't a campfire. It was a lantern, an old one, hanging from a low branch, swaying in the wind. Mason reached for it first. "Hello?" he called out, but there was no answer. The forest stayed still. The lantern burned steady, its flame barely moving even in the cold wind. I remember the shape of it, rusted metal, glass smudged with soot. Underneath it, the ground was disturbed, like something had been dug up and then covered again. I felt the back of my neck tighten. That's when I saw another reflective marker, right beside the lantern, nailed to the same tree. But this one was bent, scratched, dulled, almost angry-looking compared to the others. That was the moment I knew we weren't just lost. Someone had put those markers there, but not for hikers. They weren't meant to guide, they were meant to mislead. We backed away, careful not to make noise. Mason whispered, "Someone's out here." His voice trembled. We turned off our lights and stood still in the dark. And that's when we heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Not animals, not echo. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. We ran. No plan, no direction. Just pure instinct. Branches whipped our faces, roots caught our feet, and every breath burned. Behind us, the footsteps kept pace, never rushing, never faltering. We didn't stop until the stream widened into a shallow pool where the moonlight hit the surface like glass. We crouched there, trying to listen, trying to breathe quietly. After a long while, the sound faded. We waited even longer, afraid to move. When the woods finally fell still again, we followed the stream downstream until we stumbled onto a dirt road. When the ranger found us at dawn, we were barely coherent. He told us that trail had been closed for over a year due to landslides. The reflective markers, those weren't official trail markers. They were part of an old search and rescue route from a missing hiker case, one that was never solved. The lantern? No one could explain it. That night left something in me, a kind of caution that never really fades. Now, whenever I hike, I don't just look for where the trail leads. I look for what it's trying to tell me. Because sometimes the forest doesn't want you to follow. Sometimes it wants to test whether you'll find your own way out, even when everything familiar turns against you. The woods aren't cruel. They're honest. They'll strip you down to what's real, your fear, your will, your instincts. You learn who you are when there's no road left, no signal, no map. You learn that sometimes the only way forward is to stop following the things that shine the brightest. I didn't go back into the woods for nearly a year after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those reflective markers shining through the dark like eyes waiting in silence. Sometimes I'd hear the soft scrape of boots on dirt that weren't mine. Sometimes I'd dream about the lantern, how its flame stayed still, how it didn't flicker even though the wind had been howling. Fear changes shape when you survive it. It stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something that lives in you, quiet and watchful, reminding you what it costs to forget that nature doesn't owe you safety. Mason never talked much about it. We tried once, over beers, months later. He said it didn't make sense, the way the compass spun, the way the markers always looped left. He said maybe we'd been disoriented, maybe exhaustion had twisted our perception. I wanted to believe him. He said I wanted to think it was just human error. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The woods are full of stories, old ones. Some of them aren't written down anywhere, but they hang in the air, passed between locals, whispered around campfires, and once you've been out there long enough, you start to feel that the forest remembers things that people have forgotten. When I finally went back, it was spring. The world was green again, new, alive, forgiving. I told myself I needed to face it, to see the place in daylight, to prove it was just woods and not some nightmare stitched into the soil. I found the ranger who'd helped us that night. He was an older man named Harlan, the kind who spoke slow and watched your eyes when he talked. I asked him if he remembered the search and rescue team that had used those markers. He nodded, but there was hesitation behind it. They were looking for a man, he said, a hiker who went missing in '09. Left his camp just before dusk, said he saw lights in the woods, never came back. That man had been following the same markers we did. They found his pack, his shoes, even his flashlight, but not him. And the strange part? The markers weren't supposed to be there anymore. After the search ended, the rangers removed them. or thought they did. I walked the edge of that trail again just to see. The new growth had covered most of it, but a few trees still bore faint scars, small round holes where nails had once been. The air felt normal in daylight, almost ordinary. But when I reached the spot where the ground dipped, where the air grew colder even under sunlight, I stopped. There was no lantern now, no sign of disturbance, just a patch of moss, soft and damp beneath my boots. For a moment, I thought maybe the forest was giving me back my peace. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just a faint glint, barely visible between the leaves. A tiny scrap of metal wedged deep in the bark of a tree. A fragment of a reflector, bent and rusted like it had been waiting for me to find it. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had spoken to me in its own way. Not through voices or shapes or fear, but through memory. It was as if the woods were reminding me that every trail has two stories. The one you walk and the one that walks you. The first you can map, trace, and share. The second, you only feel. It moves behind you, beside you, in the rhythm of your breath and the crunch of your boots. Since then, I've gone deeper into the mountains than I ever thought I would. Alone, sometimes. Cautious, always. And I've learned something that I wish I could have told myself that night in the dark. The forest doesn't test you because it hates you. It tests you because it knows how small you are, and it wants you to see it too. Once you understand that, the fear doesn't leave, but it changes. It becomes respect. There's a silence in those hills that humbles you, the kind that makes you realize how much noise you carry inside. Out there, you learn to listen differently. You start hearing things you never noticed, the rhythm of the wind, the low groan of trees shifting in the soil, the heartbeat of water running beneath stone. And somewhere in that stillness, you understand that being lost isn't always the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes it's the only way to learn the difference between following and being led. I still camp in the Appalachians. I still walk alone sometimes, even when the trails fade to nothing but instinct. But now I don't chase the reflective things. I look for the steady ones, the fixed stars, the sound of running water, the feel of the ground beneath my boots. I know better now that not every light in the woods is meant to guide you home. Some lights are there to see if you've learned how to find home on your own. Every so often, when I'm deep enough into the wilderness that my phone goes silent and the only company I have is the hum of the forest, I think about that night, the loops we walked, the voice I thought I heard, the lantern that burned without wind. And I wonder, what if the forest wasn't trying to scare us at all? What if it was trying to teach us to stop looking for the easy way out? The woods have a language older than any map or trail marker. You feel it in your bones when the sun dips and the mist rolls through the trees. It whispers that not everything shining in the dark is salvation. Some things glimmer just to remind you how easily we mistake direction for destiny. So when you find yourself lost, out there, or anywhere, don't panic. Don't follow blindly. Stop. Listen. The forest will tell you everything you need to know if you're quiet enough to hear it. Because in the end, the lesson was simple. Those reflective markers didn't lead us in circles. We did that ourselves, trusting what glittered instead of what grounded us. The forest just showed us the truth, and sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. Yeah, I'd like to say that night faded with time, that I stopped thinking about it once the days got long again and the air smelled like spring. But it never really left. Nights in the woods still sound different now. Not louder, not quieter, just aware. Every rustle feels like it's waiting for a response. Every breeze feels like it's carrying a story. Sometimes, when I camp alone, I'll wake up before dawn. The fire's gone cold and the forest sits still, holding its breath before sunrise. That's when it comes back, that feeling from the Appalachian night. The sense that something out there is watching, not with malice, but with patience. Like the woods are reminding me that they existed long before me and will exist long after. That I'm just passing through, a flicker in their memory. I've started leaving small offerings when I camp now, not out of superstition, but out of respect. a stone stacked on another, a branch laid neatly beside a fallen log. It's my way of saying I'm here, but I know this isn't mine. I've met locals who do the same, people who've lived their whole lives near these mountains. They say the forest doesn't forget who listens. Maybe that's why I feel calm there now, like the fear has been replaced with a quiet kind of trust. But I'll tell you something, I never follow reflective markers anymore. Not on trees, not on old trails, not even the kind meant for safety. There's something about that cold gleam in the dark that feels too much like false hope. I've learned to rely on the sound of running water, on the direction of the wind, on the way moss grows thickest on the northern side of trees. Nature has her signs, but they're not made of metal. They're living, breathing, honest. Every hiker who's been lost knows there's a moment when the panic breaks. When you stop running and realize that the forest isn't trying to trap you, it's trying to slow you down, to make you pay attention. The first time I understood that, I was kneeling beside a stream, watching the current slide over rocks, slick with moss. The sound was soft, steady, like a voice that had been talking all along. I'd just been too loud to hear it. That's when it hit me. Maybe the circles we walked that night weren't just in the woods. Maybe they were inside us. The endless looping of fear, control, and pride. We thought we were explorers, but we were just wanderers refusing to admit we were lost. The forest had to break us down to show us that truth, to humble us. You don't come back from something like that unchanged. Mason and I drifted apart after that trip, not out of anger, just distance. He said he wanted to forget, but I think some part of him never could. For me, it became a quiet obsession. I started reading about old rescue operations, unsolved disappearances, folklore tied to the Appalachians. You'd be surprised how many stories start the same way, with lights in the trees. Always just a few steps off the main trail, always where the land dips and the air grows still. Some say it's tricksters, or the ghosts of the lost, or the forest reclaiming what's hers. I don't pretend to know, but I know this: not every mystery needs to be solved. Some are meant to remind us that the world still holds things we can't explain, and maybe that's what keeps it sacred. The mountains don't scare me anymore, not like they used to. Now, when I hike through those shadowed valleys and hear the wind threading through the branches, I feel something close to gratitude. The forest took me apart that night, but it gave me something in return, a sense of scale, of reverence, of knowing my small place in something infinite. And sometimes if I'm walking at dusk and the path starts to fade, I'll see a glint ahead, just a trick of the light on a wet leaf or a shard of quartz in the dirt. It'll catch my eye, bright, tempting. And for a heartbeat, I'll remember that night, the way we followed those markers deeper and deeper, thinking we were being guided. Then I'll look away, breathe deep, and keep walking in the dark, trusting the forest instead of what shines. Because the truth is, we're all walking through woods of our own making, each of us following something reflective, comfort, memory, pride, fear, thinking it'll lead us out. But sometimes you have to stop chasing what glitters and start trusting what's real. The wind, the earth, the silence, the things that don't lie. The forest taught me that. It taught me that survival isn't about finding the way out. It's about learning to stand still, to listen, to recognize when the light you're chasing isn't meant for you. And that's why to this day, when I hike alone and the dark settles in and my lamp flickers against the trees, I whisper the same words under my breath. A promise, a reminder. I won't follow what shines. I'll follow what's true. And somehow, every time, the forest lets me pass. The mountains have a strange way of playing tricks on your sense of direction and your sanity. When the sun dips behind the ridgeline and the mist rolls in, it's not just your compass that starts to spin, it's your thoughts. That night, our GPS told us we were floating somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But we were standing on a rocky slope 5,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper names we didn't know. My name's Andrew Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent more weekends in the Appalachian wilderness than I have in my own living room. I grew up near Boone, North Carolina, a small town where every trail leads to a story, and every local has one they swear is true. I've hiked through storms, slept through howls, and watched fog swallow entire valleys. But nothing, not the bears, not the cold, not the endless nights, prepared me for what happened on Cold Spring Mountain last October. We started the hike late, later than we should have. It was me, my cousin Tyler, and his friend Josh, who'd never been out past a campground before. The plan was simple: reach the old fire tower by dusk, set up camp, and spend the night watching the lights of distant towns blink like fallen stars. We packed light, too light I realize now, and brought one phone for navigation. A phone that, for reasons I still don't understand, later insisted we were adrift at sea. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of boots on damp leaves and the low murmur of the wind threading through the pines. But as we gained elevation, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, older. Some twisted as if they'd been frozen mid-turn. The sunlight barely touched the ground anymore. Every sound echoed longer than it should have, even the rustle of our jackets. Tyler joked that the woods felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but waiting. I brushed it off. You learn, hiking in the Appalachians, that the mind can twist silence into something alive. But even as I said that, I caught myself glancing behind us, not because I heard anything, but because I felt something, like the forest was aware of us. Watching, maybe, judging. By the time we reached the ridge, the sky had started to fade from gold to steel. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. We stopped to check the GPS, just to confirm we were still on track. Tyler pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and frowned. "What the hell?" he muttered. On the map, our little blue location dot pulsed in the middle of a massive blue expanse. Ocean. The label beneath it read North Atlantic. The elevation said 5,042 feet. I laughed at first. Some kind of glitch, I thought. Maybe bad signal. But when Josh opened his phone, the same thing appeared. Different model, same result. It was as if the world itself had misplaced us. Now, logic says don't trust tech in the wild. GPS errors happen all the time. But the air changed in that moment. It got colder, heavier. And when I looked around, the forest didn't look the same anymore. The mist that had been hugging the ridge began to thicken, curling around the trunks like smoke. Visibility dropped fast. Within minutes, the path vanished. We tried retracing our steps, but every turn looked identical. The same dead tree, the same slick boulder. Tyler marked a tree with his knife, just in case. 10 minutes later, we saw the same mark again, from the same angle. That was when the panic started to creep in. We decided to stop moving, set up camp right there until morning. But the wind didn't sound like wind anymore. It came in bursts like whispers, soft and circular. Josh swore he heard someone say his name. When we told him he was just tired, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Then why did you hear it too?" I didn't answer. Because I had. We built a small fire, small because the wood was damp and the air didn't want to take the flame. The smoke hung low, swirling instead of rising. None of us said much after that. The forest seemed to press in closer the darker it got. Every flicker of light made the shadows move. At one point, Tyler took his phone out again. Still ocean. Still 5,000 feet. But the battery icon hadn't dropped a single % in hours. It was frozen. He shut it off and said nothing. We all stared into the fire, trying not to listen to the forest breathing around us. When you're in the woods that deep, your brain starts to invent things. Faces in the trees, footsteps that don't exist. But that night, there were no inventions, just presence, the kind that doesn't care if you acknowledge it or not. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of running water. Not a stream, it was too rhythmic, too strong, like waves crashing. I opened the tent and felt cold mist on my face, heavy and damp. The sound got louder, and for one brief, disorienting second, I smelled salt, sea salt. The forest had vanished into a white wall of fog. Our fire was dead, and in the distance, maybe 20 yards away, I could see a shape, not human, not animal, just tall, still. Its edges blurred like a mirage, but I could see it watching. When I blinked, it was gone. The sound of waves stopped, and the forest came back to life like it had been holding its breath. I didn't wake the others. I just sat there until dawn, staring at the mist as it slowly retreated down the slope. By morning, everything looked ordinary again. Same trees, same ground, same sky. But when Tyler checked his phone, the location still hadn't changed. Ocean, coordinates that didn't exist. We hiked down in silence, not speaking until we reached the gravel road. The moment our boots hit asphalt, both phones corrected themselves. The map jumped back to land, a small blue dot right on Cold Spring Mountain. Battery percentage dropped instantly from full to red. That was 2 years ago. I've gone back since. Not to hike, not to camp, just to stand near the trailhead and watch the tree line. There's something about that mountain that doesn't let go once it's found you. Locals don't go there after dusk. Some say it's because of old mines, pockets of magnetic interference. Others say the mountain remembers those who don't respect it. I don't know which version I believe anymore. What I do know is this. Out there, where the fog swallows your sense of direction and the forest makes its own rules, you learn something about fear. It isn't the fear of being lost, it's the fear of realizing the world isn't as mapped as you thought. That there are places where reality bends, where man's logic doesn't apply, and sometimes your GPS isn't wrong. Sometimes you are in the middle of an ocean, a sea of trees, a tide of silence, and if you're not careful, it might pull you under. A week after we got back, I couldn't shake it. The feeling that something had followed us home, not physically, but in thought, in silence. I'd wake up at night and check my phone, half expecting to see that same map again, blue water stretching endlessly under a blinking dot. I didn't tell anyone, not even Tyler. But I started reading. Old maps, missing person reports, Appalachian folklore. And that's when I learned that Cold Spring Mountain wasn't just any mountain. Locals used to call it the Drowned Ridge. I found the name in a 1960s survey record, scrawled in pencil beside the official title. When I asked around at a diner near the base, the kind of place where everyone's known everyone for 50 years, the old man at the counter looked up from his coffee and said quietly, "You went up there?" His tone wasn't curious, it was warning. He told me that decades ago, before digital maps, surveyors complained their compasses spun wildly near the ridge, like standing over a whirlpool, one wrote. There were stories about radios picking up maritime distress calls from ships that sank hundreds of miles away, others about hikers vanishing for a night and waking up miles from where they'd camped, soaked to the bone no rain had fallen. The locals believed the mountain was cursed, or more precisely, reclaimed. There was an old mining operation deep beneath it, sealed off in the 1940s after a flood broke through a forgotten shaft. Every worker inside drowned. Some said the mountain swallowed them whole. Others swore that when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the water rushing under the ground, carrying whispers with it. That phrase, carrying whispers, stuck with me, because that's exactly what it sounded like the night we camped there. I went back one more time, alone this time, a few weeks later. Not to prove anything, just to see if I could understand. I parked at the base, hiked a few miles up until I reached the point where our GPS had gone haywire. The forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that hums in your chest. When I opened my map app, the dot flickered. It didn't show the ocean this time, but it didn't show the trail either. Just a blank white screen. For a few seconds, I thought my phone froze. Then, faintly, a line began to appear across the display. Not a trail, a horizon, the outline of a wave. I shut it off. I didn't need proof. I'd seen enough. On the hike down, I noticed something I hadn't before. Pieces of wood, blackened and splintered, scattered across the slope like bones. They weren't fallen trees. They were remnants of the old fire tower, the one we'd never reached that night. I realized then how close we'd been, maybe 100 yards at most, and still, somehow, we'd been nowhere at all. When I told the story to a forest ranger months later, he listened quietly, didn't laugh, didn't question. When I mentioned the GPS reading the ocean, he nodded and said, "You're not the first." He told me their equipment sometimes picks up what looks like sea level readings in that area. Depth measurements. Could be interference, he said. Could be the iron. Could be something deeper. Then he paused and added, almost to himself, or maybe the mountain just remembers what it used to be. That line hit me harder than I expected, because what if he was right? What if the mountain wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by its own history? Water buried beneath stone, movement trapped under time. What if, in some strange way, it was still alive, remembering what it felt like to drown? I started thinking about how often we rely on screens, signals, coordinates, all the little devices that make us believe we know where we are. But standing on that ridge, staring at a phone that insisted we were adrift in an endless ocean, I realized something. We don't really find our way in nature. We're granted it. The forest lets you pass, the mountain lets you climb, the night lets you sleep. And when it decides you've taken too much, it takes something back. Tyler doesn't hike anymore. He sold his gear, moved to a city where the sky glows orange every night and no one can see the stars. Josh pretends it never happened, says it was just fog and bad data, but I know better. I can feel it every time I drive past that stretch of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The air gets thicker, the radio static changes pitch, and my hands grip the wheel without thinking. Sometimes I pull over just to look, to listen. The forest never looks the same twice. I've learned to respect that now. The thin line between where the map ends and the unknown begins. Because the truth is, the wilderness doesn't owe us understanding. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just is. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, that there are places so wild, so ancient, that they can bend reality for a night and remind us how small we truly are. So if you ever find yourself on Cold Spring Mountain, or any ridge where the fog seems too thick, where your GPS starts showing blue instead of green, don't panic. Don't shout. Just listen, because sometimes the mountain speaks in ways the living can't. And if, by chance, you smell salt on the wind, don't look for the ocean. It's already found you. I didn't go back to the mountains for almost a year after that. Every time I thought about hiking again, I felt the weight of that silence pressing against my chest, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of memory, the kind that listens back. I'd scroll through old photos of my trips, sunsets over ridgelines, tents glowing from within, friends laughing by the fire. But no matter how bright those memories were, they all carried the same undertone. That quiet question that lingered since that night. What did we really walk into? Sometimes I think fear isn't about monsters or shadows or even death. It's about realizing you've stepped into a place that doesn't belong to you, and for a fleeting moment, that place decides to remind you. That realization changed how I see the woods. I used to think of nature as something to conquer, to navigate. Now I see it as something sacred, ancient, something you enter like a cathedral, not a playground. When I finally hiked again, it wasn't to chase fear or adventure. It was to pay respect to the mountain, to the silence, to whatever force had allowed me to walk away that night. There's a line in an old Appalachian song that says, "The mountain don't keep what it don't want." I used to think that meant danger. Now I think it means grace. We're all just visitors here, brief, fragile, moving through a world older than our words. On that first hike back, I went alone again. I chose a different mountain this time, lower, gentler, closer to town. I took only what I needed, a small pack, a compass, and a map I could hold in my hands. No GPS, no screens, just the rhythm of my footsteps and the heartbeat of the forest. As dusk fell, the woods began to glow with that quiet silver light that lives between day and night. I built a small fire and sat beside it, listening. Every crackle of flame, every rustle in the leaves, it all felt connected, like the mountain was breathing with me. For the first time since that night, I felt peace. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A low rush of wind that sounded almost like waves. Not menacing, not close, just distant. A reminder. I didn't panic this time. I just closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to the dark. Because maybe that sound wasn't a warning. Maybe it was an echo. Maybe it was the mountain's way of saying, I remember you too. We spend our lives trying to map everything, the land, the stars, even our own fears. But out there, deep in the Appalachians, you learn that some things can't be mapped. Not because they're invisible, but because they're alive. They shift. They choose when to be seen. And that's what keeps me coming back. Not for the thrill, not for the stories, but for that feeling, the moment when you're standing in the dark, miles from anyone, and the forest hums in a way that tells you you're part of something vast, something that doesn't need you but accepts you for a moment anyway. So, if you ever find yourself out there, far from the lights, and your GPS suddenly stops making sense, don't fight it. Don't rush to fix it. Let yourself be lost for a while. Let the mountain teach you what it means to listen, because sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found on any map. They're found in the quiet moments between fear and awe, where your pulse slows, your breath steadies, and you realize you've stopped trying to own the world. You're finally just in it. And when the wind starts to sound like waves again, soft, rolling, distant, maybe it's not the ocean calling you home. Maybe it's the mountain, reminding you that not all who are lost are meant to be found. That night on Cold Spring Mountain taught me something I'll never forget. Not every mystery needs solving. Some are meant to humble you, some are meant to change you, and some, if you're lucky, are meant to carry you, like a tide, back to who you really are. So go ahead, hike past sundown, let the fog swallow the trail, let the night whisper your name. But remember this. When your GPS says you're in the middle of the ocean, 5,000 feet up a mountain, maybe you are. Maybe you're standing where the world folds in on itself, where land and water, time and memory all blur together for a breathless moment. And maybe, just maybe, the mountain is showing you its reflection. The place where fear becomes reverence, where getting lost becomes the only way to truly be found.